Shalom and welcome to another edition of our Daily Bread on Messianic Torah. And this week's parashat is the third parashat of the book of Vayikra, also called Leviticus, and it's called Shemini, which means eighth. And this is the second video of my message for 2014-15 called Should It Be Accepted? And this video part is called Nadav and Avihu. The first video is called Offerings for Glory. The link is below for the first video if you missed it, and also the link for the second video, and should be also a link for the playlist if you want to watch them all in order, or you can watch them individually. So anyway, the next video, this video is called Nadav and Avihu. And the concept here is, in the first video we talked about the offerings for glory and what was required in order for God's presence to dwell. And now with this one, we're going to see that now in the parasha, God's presence comes down and the glory of YHWH appears. And this is all happening. And then Nadav and Avihu, when we get into like Leviticus 10:1, you know, after it says that the fire came and consumed upon the altar and all this, and then it says that Nadav and Avihu took either of them as censer, put fire therein with incense, and offered a strange fire before YHWH, which he commanded them not. So the interesting thing here is that Nadav and Avihu not only have a piece here, a story, but it's a parable, and there's lessons that we can learn. And the first thing is to make observations of what's happening. Well, what's happening is the glory of YHWH is finally dwelt. So this gives us a timetable of when these events are happening. So this isn't we're getting prepared and we're learning the pattern of the tabernacle and we're building the things and we're giving our free will offerings and our offerings, which are really similar to our choices. I mean, when we make a choice, it's like an offering. We can either choose to do what we want, or we can forego what we would want to do in a situation and instead choose what God would want. And when you choose what God would want, that's actually a perfect offering. You know, it says that when you give an offering, you're supposed to look it over and make sure it's perfect. You want to know what a perfect offering is obedience. That's the perfect offering. That's the one that's acceptable, is when you obey God. So when we look at this and we see Nadav and Avihu, the glory has now come. You know, when we talk about the four cups of Passover and we talk about the cup of completion and God dwelling among His people, that's happening right now. And one of the very first thing that happens, the first thing that happens once God finally dwells with His people, is people, Nadav and Avihu, start doing other things, their own ideas. And they try and present that along with what was commanded. So the offerings in the Torah, the offerings that God commands, His instruction, His Torah, is there. And that's following those is what gets you to this point where His glory comes down and dwells with you. And at the point that His glory is dwelling among you, then the response is you need to keep the Torah. Because that's what was acceptable enough to get His glory to come and dwell with you. Doing what He commanded. And so now, He's there. Now you think, okay, well once I'm there, once I've done something and I'm good with God, and God's presence is dwelling with me, then you know, hey, I thought I would do a little something here. And I thought I would kind of do my own thing. And it's like, no. It says that He commanded them not. Okay? That means that what's acceptable in reverse is what He commands you. And clearly what He didn't command them to do is not acceptable. Okay? So that points us more towards the very first part, that is that you're doing all these things so that the presence, you know, obeying the commandments so that the presence of YHWH can dwell among you. And then once the presence of YHWH is dwelling among you, now you really need to keep the commandments, right? Because if you then, you know, it reminds me of the passages in Ezekiel about the righteous man who then turns to wickedness, his righteousness will be forgotten, right? You don't want to get to that point where you're doing what's right and then do what's wrong. It's worse for you, okay? So your offerings after the glory, that's what I titled this segment, the subtitle, is is saying that once you're dwelling with God, there's the expectation of obedience to the commandments. So it's kind of funny because in many religions and like in Christianity and stuff, there's many people who might argue, oh, the law's done away with. They're not at God, dwelling with God, and they're wanting to throw out the commandments. Well, if you're not doing things after the pattern, and you're not offering the offerings that are acceptable and building things the way they're to be built, and all of this, which is really just a parable for saying obeying the Torah, if you're not making yourself your own personal tabernacle after the image of of the commandments, of what's been commanded, and after the pattern of the instruction of God, it's not going to be acceptable. Okay, it's not going to be a dwelling place for Elohim. Well, if you want to reject those, make your own temple after your own imagination, okay, that's a rejection of the law and the instructions before the glory appears. And I personally think that the glory just simply won't appear in those houses and in those temples or upon those people. And then they rejected it before, and now after is another form of rejecting that, where it's like, okay, if you don't keep the commandments before, then I don't think the presence of YHWH will dwell on that tabernacle. Then, even if you keep the commandments, and then the presence dwells, and then you don't maintain keeping the commandments, then what happened to Nadav and Avihu could happen to you. And so this just goes to show, as far as a time frame, the commandments, that's the Aleph, right, and the Tav. That's the beginning, right, before the presence of God, and after the presence of God, the Tav, forever. Okay? That defines forever. It's what is before God and what is after God, with God being the center. That's like Hayah, right? The Hebrew word for is. Hayah means the Yah. Yah being a name of, one of the names of God. So, the actual verb we use for is, was, and shall be, which is what that word means, who is, was, and shall be. That's the Yah, right? Hayah. And that's God. So, forever, essentially, is encompassed in that. To exist, right, embodies that concept of God. And so we see that in this example. We see that with the offerings for glory, what was before God. We see that when God appears and what you do after God appears, that whole segment has to be sandwiched and in obedience to His Torah. And if it isn't, it self-destructs wherever you're at. If you don't obey before God's presence, you'll be in trouble. If you don't obey at God, before God even, you'll be in trouble. After God's dwelling with you, you don't obey, you'll be in trouble. So, the one thing that's consistent, Le'olam va'ed, forever and ever, is obedience to the Torah. And this is one of the simplest things, but yet it's one of the things that's most commonly lost. And there's 1,000 ways that people argue against it and try and theorize and use theology to try and say that you don't have to obey God, or that somehow obedience isn't that important, or it's a bad thing, and you're trying to be a legalist. And it's like, yeah, because a legalist is someone who would be then obeying. When you're illegal, you're a lawbreaker. So when Messiah says, "Get away from me, you who do lawlessness," that's sometimes translated iniquity. Lawlessness is those are the breakers of the law. Okay, so that by reflexive, the ones who are accepted by Messiah, who come to Him in that day, are the legalists. They're the obeyers of the law. Okay, so, but even the argument itself, trying to make obedience a negative thing, right? There's only one person who promotes that. Who's working against? Who's trying to convince people they should disobey God? The same one from the beginning, the serpent. Okay, so when you hear that argument, it might as well have a split tongue and be slithering around on there, because anyone who's trying to teach you that you shouldn't obey God's law, or that diminishes it, or try and reframes it like the serpent did, he tried to, no, it was God's plan for you to do this. No. It is not God's plan for you to disobey Him. It is God's goal, right? Mashiach said, I am the goal of the law, of the Torah. Right? His goal is obedience, because that's what Mashiach is. That's what Messiah is. Messiah is living obedience, an example of total obedience to the law, to the Torah. Okay? And he's our example. So, when we look at Nadav and Avihu, they give us a parable and an example of people who, once they got on track, that they got off track. Right? They thought they would add something to. Right? He says, don't add or don't take away. That means that you're supposed to do exactly what was said. And that's what we learn when it comes to the tabernacle. You know? And when it says, show them the tabernacle that they may be, the temple that they may be ashamed. Okay? We're the temple. And all the ways we've not been in alignment with the Word of God and the instruction, those parts are unacceptable. And whether that happened before we found the truth, and that we never had the presence of God, we've never been acceptable enough for the presence of God to dwell with, or whether we became acceptable to God and then did something else or added to it and went beyond it and did something we weren't supposed to. So that's my message about Nadav and Avihu. Hit the subscribe button, leave a comment. Love to hear you guys' comments, what you thought. And you can share the video, and the link to the next video, which is called Kosher Eating, is there. And if you didn't watch the one before that, you can, before this one, you can click on that as well. So I will say shalom.